Welcome to the first edition of Chat Bites. I'm Jennifer Filla, CEO of the Prospect Research Institute and your host today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have so many of you on the line today. Now hopefully you've read his post on the Institute's learning blog entitled Buyouts, Inversions, and Acquisitions. Oh my. Are you ready? Let's get started with the interview.
I am thrilled to introduce our guest, prospect research professional Darren Cooper, hailing from Minnesota. He's a prospect research and fundraising strategy consultant and previously worked in higher education prospect research and supply chain software sales. Thank you so much for joining us today, Darren.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, you wrote the blog post for the Prospect Research Institute, and in that post, I really liked how you were able to use a current real-life example. And with all the things we prospect researchers have to keep current about, I wondered how you heard about Medtronic.
Well, I heard about the Medtronic deal from a couple of the news sources I like to follow, including Dealbook from the New York Times and Term Sheet from Fortune, both of which are available on their websites. Plus, Medtronic is based in Minnesota, and it got a lot of coverage in the local media, so I saw it there as well. I do have to say that I didn't really pay much attention to it at first. I mean, I kind of knew what was going on, but it really didn't impact the consulting work I was doing. However, I got a little bit more interested in it when somebody posted on ProspectL about how to approach prospects who are facing a tax bill from that sale. And actually, the guest post that I wrote is an expanded version of what I wrote for the listserv.
Wonderful. Well, that makes sense, and actually it brings to bear that the ProspectL listserv is such a wonderful resource because people like you are actually answering questions.
Well, I try to do it, probably not as much as I used to because it's a little harder to have time to do that when you're self-employed, but I do try to, occasionally chime in as I feel like I can.
That's awesome. I do too, and it does take time.
Yes, it does.
So, speaking of time, I'm wondering if you have any time management tips for researchers who need to keep up with their top insider prospects.
Yes, there's actually several. The first thing to remember is that knowing who your top insider prospects are is in some ways half the battle, and that knowing who these people are and getting your fundraisers to pay attention to them is probably a lot more important than keeping on top of the minutia of every last transaction or filing that they submit to the SEC. And the second thing I'll say is when you have to prioritize your time, I think that people should probably focus more on the insider activity or insider prospects that are, actively being cultivated by one of your fundraisers. It's not that you should ignore the other ones, the ones that you haven't necessarily elevated to the radar screen of your fundraiser. But any time you spend on, researching a prospect that's not really in your pipeline is time you could do something else that may be more productive. The third thing I'll say is that you can use tools that are either really inexpensive or even free to keep track of these prospects. So two things that you can do. Number one, you can track general news and information on a specific prospect with a relatively simple Google alert. And I'm a Google Apps user, so just in the interest of full disclosure, I will say that I'm not necessarily recommending Google, but I am a user myself. And then the other thing you can do is that an insider's SEC filings from the SEC website, you can actually track those with an RSS reader. And actually, since a Google alert can be delivered as an RSS feed, you could track both their activity and their Google alert activity using an RSS reader. And then the last thing that I like to tell people, and this is true about all forms of proactive research, is I do recommend being pretty strategic about the information you're sharing with fundraisers. So not every news event that a prospect has in their life is really a big deal, and not every insider transaction will have a material impact on their ability to make a gift. Of course, it takes time to develop the talent to know what you should share and what you shouldn't share. And if you're ever not sure if you're sharing too much or too little, the best way to get feedback is to ask your fundraiser to say, is this what you need? I want to make sure that I'm sending you the right information. So those are my tips for time management.
Well, that's some great advice. I don't think I've used an RSS reader in quite a while for various reasons, finding different methods to look at things. But it sounds intriguing that you can use an RSS reader with Edgar. Can you just explain a tiny bit more about that?
Yeah, basically, if you go into Edgar and you search for a person, so let's say we would search for Tim Cook, who's the CEO of Apple. So you would go in and in the search field you'd type Cook space Timothy, and then his filings page would come up. And more likely than not, the result that you would see would actually be blank. And the reason is that when you search for a name in Edgar, it's always going to default by excluding their Form 3, 4, and 5 filings, which for a person is generally the only filings they have. So you have to tell the search box basically to include those filings, and then you'll actually see all the results that you're looking for, and that's the page where it'll actually output the result as an RSS feed that you could then subscribe to with an RSS reader.
Got it. I am definitely going to give that a try. That's really cool. And, what I'm hearing from you in the last tips that you gave, especially that last one, talking with the fundraiser, providing the information that they're most interested in, staying focused on those prospects that are already being cultivated. You alluded to that kind of stuff in your blog post. You talked about solicitation strategies and timing. Can you share with us a little bit more about how you learned to work so well with frontline fundraisers?
Well, primarily I learned them from working with fundraisers and asking them lots of questions and frankly engaging in a lot of trial and error. But I've also had the opportunity to have some professional development that was more focused on learning about fundraising rather than just learning about research. So I was very, very fortunate that a past employer funded a week-long fundraising class for me and provided some other opportunities for not just the fundraising staff, but also the research staff to get some additional training over time. And those experiences were always really valuable. Even though, let's face it, when you go to a fundraiser training, you're probably going to be in a room full of fundraisers, and that may take you out of your comfort zone. And so you have to kind of adjust to that. And once you get used to it, it's really not that bad, and it is really useful information. The other thing I'll say is that our profession used to and still to a certain extent talks about the importance of getting a seat at the table, but I think that's just the beginning of the process. And ultimately, you have to understand how fundraisers are using the information that you're providing to them, and the best way to figure out is to ask them. And then when you do ask them, you have to kind of ask them in a way that demonstrates how you're going to use that information to improve the value of what you provide to them and the value of that relationship. And then the last thing I recommend to people is it's really important for a researcher, particularly a new researcher, to have someone who can mentor them as a researcher. So when I started in research about 9 years ago, I had a mentor, and that person was very helpful to me. But subsequently, I learned or decided that I also needed to have a relationship with a fundraiser that was a mentoring relationship, somebody who could provide me feedback from that different perspective. And that was a very useful thing for me, and I recommend that researchers try to identify a fundraiser who can mentor them as well.
I think that's spectacular advice. Fortunately, I don't think I ever really felt separated from fundraising. I never worked in one of those, big shops where the researchers were physically and otherwise separated from fundraisers, and it's made a huge difference for me. I always belonged to the Association of Fundraising Professionals and attended meetings and always learned about fundraising along with research, which I think you're right. It's pretty key.
Yes, I agree.
But let's get, researchy and detailed and, some would say nerdy, but I'm not sure that's true. So one of the things that I really want to know about with your blog post, and then we can go to the audience and ask some questions because I think they probably have questions too. But you mentioned that there are possible adverse tax consequences for insider prospects during a change in control. And then you gave this wise advice about don't approach the prospect too soon before he or she has even thought about those tax consequences, because we don't want to be the bearer of bad news. And I'm wondering, when it comes to stock options coming due, things like that, do you think it's possible, and those tax consequences like of appreciated stock, do you think it's possible that executives are not sort of aware of that all the time and that we should be concerned about approaching them too soon?
Probably not, for a couple of different reasons. The biggest difference, though, is that when you're talking about options and restricted stock, the tax rules are different. And making a gift of stock to offset the tax liability from vested options and vested restricted stock and stock option exercises doesn't work as well. And mainly it's because when you exercise stock options or restricted stock vests, you're actually paying taxes at the ordinary income tax rate as opposed to like the capital gains tax rate, which is lower. Thus, the potential tax benefits are not as large, and therefore they may not motivate the donor as much. I cannot definitively say how aware the typical insider is of their vesting schedule either. I did actually work at a public company back at the end of the tech bubble, and I had coworkers, they knew exactly when their options were going to vest. They knew their strike price. They knew exactly how much money they expected to make, essentially, when those options were actually exercised. And some of them could probably tell you in minute detail how they plan to spend it.
Wow.
But I can't really guarantee that my experience was a representative one. However, public company insiders, they have, their obligation to file reports with the SEC. They have certain deadlines that they have to meet. And while in most cases the SEC generally will not penalize a company if one of their executives does not make a filing on time, if the company's executives are consistently missing their deadlines, that may reflect badly on the company. So that company's CFO or general counsel is probably sending out reminders to its key insiders to make sure that they're submitting their SEC filings on time. Given that, and knowing that a typical insider probably has to actually make filings 2 or 3 times a year at the very minimum, I think it's reasonable to assume that they're pretty familiar with when their options are going to vest and what the consequences will be to them in regards to their income and tax situation. But I really don't know.
Right. But you told me something I wasn't clear on.
Right.
And that it's, the ordinary income tax rate instead of the capital gains. That's a big difference.
It's a pretty big difference for somebody who's in the top tax bracket, because it's the top marginal income tax rate just for federal is 39% or 39.6%, whereas the top capital gains rate is, I think, no higher than about 24%. So it's a pretty significant difference.
Yeah, that's a big deal. Well, I would like to take this time, and I'm going to pause a little to take questions. I know that you're going to have to do the *6, so we'll give just a minute for you to do that and ask a question.
Feel free to just jump right in and ask one.
Can I ask would you go over again what the tax, I was trying to write fast, tax rules are different for, vested stock, vested option, vested restricted. I'm not clear on what you said.
Okay, so if we go back to the Medtronic example that basically inspired the blog post that you read, basically the insiders in that situation were facing a large tax bill, but it was almost exclusively capital gains tax. The capital gains tax rate, depending on your tax bracket, is usually either 15% or 20%. For just insiders in general, when they are being, when they're granted stock options and restricted stock, and those options are eventually exercised and or their restricted stock vests, the gains on those actions are not considered capital gains. They're just considered ordinary income, and those are taxed at a much higher rate because there's no favorable income tax rate for ordinary income as there is for capital gains. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So.
And I'm not a tax preparer, so.
No. So our average insider who's filing that we're monitoring, through SEC info or something, they have a greater advantage to be giving us stock than necessarily somebody who's going through a change in control?
No, I would say the person going through the change in control has a greater advantage.
Oh, okay. Okay. But it's not necessarily tax.
It is a tax advantage, and the reason is that if you have a highly appreciated stock and you make a gift of it, not only are you avoiding the capital gains tax, but the entire value of the shares that you gift is deductible against that donor's ordinary income taxes.
Right.
So it's a twofold advantage, whereas if it's the vesting of options in restricted stock, then yes, you can make a stock gift to offset that tax liability, but you will not also be getting a significant or an as significant capital gains tax advantage in some of those situations.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Does anyone have any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, earlier when you were talking about using an RSS reader with Edgar,
yes.
I've never actually used an RSS reader. Is that a software that you install, or could you just explain that for kind of briefly?
Yes, and I will try to give the short explanation. So RSS stands for Really Simple Syndication. For those on the call that were devoted users of Google Reader, and the fact that product was discontinued, Google Reader was the probably most commonly used RSS reader. The way that RSS works is that a web page will publish a feed, which is called an RSS feed, and then you can essentially subscribe to that feed using your RSS reader. So a common one now is like Feedly is an RSS reader. That's the one that I use, and I'm not necessarily recommending it. Mm-hmm. And what the RSS reader will do is it'll look at that feed that you have subscribed to, and it will tell you which articles you have read and which you haven't. And then you can actually go through and review things that you haven't previously read and mark them as read and things like that. It's primarily used for following various news sites. That's what I use mine for. But all kinds of information is published as RSS feeds, and the SEC filings in Edgar is just one example of that. That's probably not a 100% complete answer to your question. But
actually, that was perfect. That's exactly kind of the thing I wanted to know, so thanks.
Any other questions?
I have one more question for you, and then we can wrap it up today. Is that fair, Darren?
Sure.
Okay. Just a broad general question. Do you have any advice for a prospect researcher who's intimidated by these public company filings? Because they're pretty detailed and cryptic.
Yes, and honestly, the best advice I can give is unfortunately the hardest advice, and that's practice makes perfect. And the reason is that interpreting the filings from the SEC it's kind of like those word problems that we had to solve for like 7th and 8th grade math class. And nobody really liked those, and most people probably wouldn't like them now if they were forced to revisit their middle school math homework. In addition to just, reading more of them and trying to, gain more exposure to them, I always find that when I'm working with the numbers in an SEC filing, that rather than trying to keep them all straight on a notepad or a scratch pad, I actually just start plugging them into a spreadsheet and then using formulas in that spreadsheet to make sure I'm doing the math correctly. So for example, if you have an insider who has a series of stock option awards that are all vested, and you want to understand what the potential value of those is if that person was to actually exercise them, you would basically take the number of shares, the strike price, the current price of the stock, and then you would set up a formula that would basically say, okay, the number of shares times the current market price minus the strike price, that equals the potential value, at least pre-tax value, for that particular block of shares if the insider was to exercise them. So if you do that, it makes it a little easier to kind of keep on top of all that. And then also it's a way that you can have someone else kind of look at your work and hopefully give you some feedback and help you identify places where you might have made an error. The other thing that I think is at least reasonably helpful is basically for every SEC form that somebody may have to file or a company may have to file, the SEC publishes either kind of an explanation guide or a user guide, basically, or instructions for that form. So I know, for example, there is an explanation guide for all three of the key insider forms, Forms 3, 4, and 5, and then they have a specific instructions file for the Form 4. And so I was able to read those, and it gave me a much better understanding of all the minute little details that you're likely to see in the form. And I think, Jen, that you have links to those posted on your website in the resources section. So
I do.
And so our callers today can go to that website and find information about it there.
Great. Well, thank you. Yes, I use an Excel spreadsheet too. I also like it as a sort of backup. When someone asks for an update on a profile, I can go back and see, how did I really arrive at all that?
Right, yes. Well, and then you can also update it more quickly with, either a change in the stock price since you last did the calculations or additional grants of options and things like that. So
yes,
it's always good to save those.
Well, Darren, thank you so much for sharing with us today.
No problem. It was fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it was great to have you. I hope that you've been inspired by Darren today. And if you want to get a better education on insider stock and compensation, I want to let you know that the Prospect Research Institute has a course that's going to be running in late April through May. So you can check that out on the website, which is prospectresearchinstitute.org. And as Darren alluded to, once you're on the website, there's a links/resources page. And I created the Prospect Research Takes Wall Street collection. And that collection will eventually include this podcast, but also some videos and links to resources. So that's all for now. I wanted to thank you so much for joining the first edition of Chat Bites. Have a great day.
Thank you.